not long gone past 7 a.m. local time in Gaza. Of course, that was the deadline for a truce between Israel and Hamas to be extended. But just over an hour before that truce was set to expire, the Israeli military said its air defence system intercepted one rocket launched from Gaza. In the last 5 minutes, the IDF has just released a statement on X. It says Hamas violated the operational pause and, in addition, fired toward Israeli territory. The IDF has resumed combat against the Hamas terrorist organisation in Gaza.
Hamas did fire a rocket from the Gaza Strip towards Israeli communities. This is, of course, contravention to the framework that we've had with them, and we did intercept that rocket.
Hamas-affiliated media is also reporting sounds of gunfire and explosions in northern Gaza, as well as rocket sirens in Israel areas near Gaza. Joining me now live for more on this is former Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Dave, appreciate your time. We've got live pictures on our screen of the Israel-Gaza border. I just want to share that statement again. The IDF says Hamas has violated the operational pause and the IDF has resumed combat against the Hamas terrorist organisation in Gaza. What does that mean in your view? Is this war back on?
I think that's quite likely, Danica. I mean, this was always going to be a temporary pause to allow for the release of hostages, and I'm glad that I think 110 hostages have been released so far, but Hamas has clearly now indicated it's not willing to release any more, and it's resumed hostilities against Israel. And so this military operation is back on and this conflict is back on. And I think when it ends is when Hamas is militarily defeated or when Hamas's senior military leadership surrenders.
We've seen over the last week, of course, a small trickle of hostages every day or every few days being released. But what happens now to those remaining hostages?
Well, look, they've been held now for close to 50 days. It seems, although we haven't had a full account from the hostages that have been released, they've been kept in pretty awful conditions. They've lost a lot of weight. They haven't had access to medication. Obviously, I mean, the taking of hostages and the holding of civilian hostages is in and of itself a war crime, and continuing to hold them is a continuing war crime. But look, these hostages are in a terrible situation, and I think Israel had indicated a willingness to continue this pause until all hostages had been released, and Israel was honouring its side of the bargain, which was releasing Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. But obviously Hamas has decided that it now wishes to resume hostilities.
Was this always inevitable in your view, dealing with such a fragile and dangerous situation as hostage negotiations? And now we hear today, of course, that Hamas has allegedly fired a rocket, according to the IDF, and that the IDF has resumed its operations in Gaza. Was it always going to happen this way?
Well, I never thought that this temporary truce or cessation of hostility was going to lead to something more permanent like a ceasefire. I think the conditions that you need for a ceasefire to be met are firstly for Hamas to end its military operations, but secondly for all the hostages to be released, and finally for Hamas to surrender its military leadership. And absent those conditions being met, Israel will continue to exercise its right to self-defence, which extends to the elimination of Hamas as a military threat.
I want to ask you about a report that came out in the New York Times that Israel had the blueprints for Hamas's attack on October 7th, a year before it took place. Now, at this stage, the IDF says it's investigating those reports and will be conducting its own investigation in the near future. But Dave Sharma, what does that suggest? If they're correct, this could have been prevented a year ago.
Well, look, I'd say the journalist, Ronan Bergman, who I know personally, he's very well connected in Israel. He's wrote the history of the Mossad. His reporting is always well-sourced and credible, so I do believe the report is credible. It doesn't surprise me. I mean, this was clearly an intelligence failure by Israel, and like most intelligence failures, it's characterised by a degree of groupthink, a degree of complacency, and a failure of imagination. And what we've seen here is that there were signs, and we've seen this in other reporting, signs that Hamas was planning a large-scale military assault, but Israeli analysts at the time either dismissed or discounted or decided that these reports were not credible. Now, look, we saw much the same thing in the lead up to the September the 11th attacks on New York in 2001, where with the benefit of hindsight, which is always 2020, you can see the signs, but it can be very difficult when you have a certain conceptual paradigm and framework to necessarily pick these needles out of a haystack of intelligence and decide that something fundamental has changed. This needs to be investigated. It will be investigated in Israel, but I think this report just confirms that this was a serious intelligence failure, Israel's worst since the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, we'll hear more about that. Dave Sharma, always good to get your opinion. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Danica.
So just repeating that breaking news, the IDF has released a statement saying Hamas violated the operational pause and in addition fired towards Israeli territory as that deadline for the truce was just about to end. In response, the IDF has resumed combat against Hamas in Gaza. So we will be keeping you up to date on that unfolding situation throughout the afternoon.